Welcome, everyone, to the session on informed consent. What is consent? Informed consent is when a person makes a choice to agree freely and voluntarily to do something. There is no consent when agreement is obtained through the use of threats, force, or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, manipulation, deception, or misrepresentation. There is also no consent when there is a threat to withhold a benefit to which the person is already entitled. And there's no consent when a promise is made to the person to provide a benefit. Consent is a two-way process. It goes beyond providing a form or document for the survivor to read and sign, and the person going along with it. It really involves explaining what will happen and answering any questions that there might be. The process for obtaining consent has three components: explaining the type of information to be disclosed, voluntariness, and understanding. Where does informed consent fit in the case management process? The case management process includes welcoming and introductions, assessment, case action planning, action plan implementation, case follow-up, and case closure. Consent fits in the welcome and introduction phase, and it also fits throughout the entire process. That means that you're consistently checking in with the survivor to see if they've changed their mind about anything. And if they do, that's totally fine. There are three types of consent that we want to consider for the gender-based violence information management system as a part of GBV case management. The three types of consent are consent for services, then there's consent for needed available referrals, and consent for sharing numbers, percentages, for reporting, advocacy, and program improvement. Consent for services means that we're getting informed consent from the survivor to provide case management services. To do this, explain the case management process, explain confidentiality and limitations, and explain survivors' rights. Ask and answer any questions, and make sure that you get consent for services verbally. That's how consent for services is received. It's received verbally. Consent for needed available referrals includes sharing identifiable information about a survivor's case in order to facilitate access to referral services that are selected. For example, you would need to receive consent for needed available referrals in order to be able to share a survivor's information with wound treatment services from the health center, as an example. Introduce the idea of referrals and the possibility of sharing relevant information for any other needed services. Make a final determination about sharing for referrals at the end of your session with the survivor. Consent for sharing numbers for reporting advocacy and program improvement includes non-identifiable information for the purpose of aggregating data into statistics to be used in reports. For example, you need to receive consent for sharing numbers for reporting and advocacy to be able to count the incident in statistics like number of rapes reported last month, or to include it in a calculation of X percent of incidents assisted last month that were children. You'll discuss consent for this at the end of your session with the survivor. Why do we need informed consent? When informed consent is skipped or completed improperly, it undermines the guiding principles of a survivor-centered approach and jeopardizes the relationship with the survivor. Obtaining informed consent demonstrates respect. It shows the survivor we intend to be collaborative and empowering, and it shows that we understand the need to be accountable to the survivor. The rights of the survivor to control their incident data must remain a priority, even when it seems like there's little risk involved. Even if data does not include the survivor's name, it is the survivor's decision if their information will be shared or not. The final steps of informed consent, once you've gone through the process of explaining processes and answering questions from the survivor, is to summarize the first section of the consent form, allowing time again for questions and clarifications of individual points. You'll summarize the second part of the section of the consent form, allowing time for questions and clarifications, again, of individual points. Then ask the survivor to repeat back in their own words what they think they're agreeing to, what the risks might be, and what would happen if they refuse. This will allow the service provider to assess the survivor's understanding of each issue, and if necessary, reinforce anything that was not clearly understood and correct any misunderstanding. Let the survivor choose yes or no for both sections of the consent form and sign. How does consent for information sharing get documented? Consent for information sharing is documented in two sections on the consent form. The first one is sharing identifiable information about their case in order to facilitate access to referral services selected. For example, to be able to share that the survivor, to be able to share information from a survivor to a wound treatment service from the health center, you would need consent for sharing identifiable information about their case. Then there's non-identified information for the purpose of aggregating data into statistics to be used in reports. For example, again, to be able to count the incident in statistics, like the number of rapes reported last month, or to include it in any calculation. With this, so there's, like I said, those three types of consent that we want to consider as a part of the case management process when it comes to information collection and sharing. Consent to move forward with case management, consent for sharing identifiable information for referrals, and consent for sharing non-identifiable information for aggregate anonymized reporting. With this, I think it's important to clarify what non-identifying information is. Non-identifying information is data that cannot be linked to a specific individual or group of individuals. All personal identifiers, such as a person's name and place of residence, are removed. So when we're talking about sharing non-identifying information, this is what we're talking about. There are several videos that exist on engaging with and going through the informed consent process using scripts as examples. We're not going to cover that in this session. Really, we just wanted to go over the process of informed consent, the types of consent we're gathering and documenting. But if you'd like to see more videos on informed consent, please let me know and I'll give you access to those links. Thank you so much for joining this session.